Okay, our first tax topic deals with filing status. Okay, so there are 5 filing statuses. Most common and most known is single. And what that means is that person they're not married. Okay, as long as they're not married, they're probably going to end up as a single, okay, on the filing status. And the second most common that is known is married filing jointly. And this is exactly as it sounds. Single is someone who's unmarried, and married filing jointly. You can only file that if you're married and both of you are filing one tax return together. So 2 taxpayers, 1 return. But a little less commonly known is married filing separately. And in married filing separately, it's actually 2 returns, 2 taxpayers and 2 tax returns. They each file their own, even though they are technically still married. They're going to file 2 returns, 1 for each of them. The most common that this gets used for is when a couple is separated, right? When they're on their way to divorce, but they're not quite divorced because paperwork hasn't gone through, or they're still figuring out the divorce decree settlements and things like that. So this is not quite divorce, but probably going to be divorce. Now, you can, at any point as a married couple, file separately. Even though you're not separated or divorced, you can just file it if you choose. But it's not advantageous to do that. Almost every situation, it's actually worse to file separately if you are married and you don't plan to be divorced soon. So we usually don't file separately unless there's a good reason. Okay. There's 2 more that almost never get talked about by most people. But they are options, and they are out there as a choice. So the first one I'm going to talk about is called a qualified widow. I think nowadays some of the textbooks and the IRS call it surviving spouse instead of widow, which basically means they were married, but their spouse has recently died, and it has to be within 2 years. So within 2 years that they've died. The year that they die, you will file jointly, and then the 2 years after they die, they can be qualifying widow. There is one other caveat with it, and that is they must have a qualifying child. And the reason why is it's a benefit, but we're not going to give it to just anyone who has a deceased spouse. It's only going to be for those who have a deceased spouse and are still raising a child. And then the very last one, which is somewhat the same vein as qualified widow, is head of household. Okay, and head of household, it sounds like, well, a single person could be their own head of household. For instance, I am unmarried, but yet I own my own house. Therefore, am I not head of household? Well, the reality is head of household is just a very nice way of saying single parent. Head of household is for people who are unmarried who have a qualifying child. Okay, so they also must have a qualifying child, but they are not someone who has been recently widowed. And you can be head of household and never have been married, but you cannot be qualified widow unless you have been married and were recently widowed. Okay, so for instance, say a person in their 20s starts working. They are single, and then they get married when they're, say, 24, 25. and then they, you know, get to the age of about 40, their spouse dies young, and for the next 2 years, as they're still raising that child, they can be qualifying widow, and then after those 2 years have passed, they're still raising a child, they can drop to head of household, and once their child has grown up, they no longer qualify as a child, then that person would therefore go back up to single. So your status can change over time for different reasons, but the gist of it is unmarried, married and, you know, filing 1 to return together, married filing 2 returns together, recently deceased spouse with a kid, and a single parent. Okay? Now, what counts as a qualifying child? Well, pretty much any child who's some sort of relative that you are taking care of full time. Before we get really into that, let me go ahead and show you the decision tree. So I know there's a lot of information right there, and there will be lots more information throughout the tax return, you know, learning process. So I'm going to show you the PDF. So this is the 4012, which is the Volunteer Resource Guide. It's got tons of information on it, and if you have it open in your Chrome, it might open up to this. Go here, press this little thing, and you can see the little tabs that make it easier to find all the things we're looking for. So here under tab B, we have starting return and filing status. So we're going to go here, and we're going to look at this determination of filing status decision tree. So if you're not quite sure which filing status to choose, this would be kind of your go-to. So you can find this B10 on the Volunteer Resource Guide, and you would just go through the questions. Okay, so these will help you figure out where you are or where the taxpayer is on this and give you a way to quickly go through and find all the answers you need. And a little bit further down on B12 is who is a qualifying person. And basically the gist of it is anyone who is related to you, who you are basically taking care of and claiming as a dependent. If you're basically providing everything for their life, including sheltering them, feeding them, you know, yada, 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 clothing them, if you're doing all that, they're pretty much going to count for your qualifying child, as long as they're also under the age in order to be a qualifying person, okay? So lots of people who can be give you that, you know, head of household or qualified widow status. So this is a great resource. Make sure you're looking at, you know, B10 and B12. B10 is for the decision tree, and B12 for who counts for head of household. Okay, and then we go back to the whiteboard. I also want to point out which one's the best. There's arguments, and people think, you know, one might be the better than the other, and I sometimes get people asking me, well, I'm married and I always file jointly. Should I file separately because, you know, I've heard that can give you more income, or less taxes on your income. In general, the best filing status is follow this trend. Married filing jointly and qualified widow are essentially the same. Just one is your spouse is alive or not. That's really the only difference. Other than that, as far as pretty much all the tax things, they're pretty much all the same. Okay, and they're the best. They give you the most standard deduction. They give you the most of this, yada, yada, yada. And then after that is head of household. Head of household is the next best. It has a higher standard deduction, and some other limitations are a little bit higher, but not many, but some. And then the next is actually single. Single is actually better than married filing separately in most cases. And the reason why is married filing separately the worst is they lose a lot of deductions. They lose a lot of deductions and tax advantages that single and married filing jointly and pretty much all the others get, but married filing separately lose out on. And that's because you got two taxpayers filing two returns, even though it's a whole weird system, but they lose deductions this way. One other thing to note with the head of household is that even if you are legally married, if you qualify for head of household other than the fact that you're married, and you really should be married filing separately, like your husband or your wife left you years ago or whatever, if you have been living separately from your spouse for more than 6 months and you have a qualifying child, you can actually still file for head of household regardless of the fact that you're still married. But there is that 6 months requirement, okay? So you do have to be living away from your spouse for 6 months in order to get that. And that about covers it for filing statuses. There's only 5 of them, but they're quite complicated, and they have all their own little advantages, and everyone has one that they fit into.